Hello there, friends and enemies. My name is Toxy. Welcome back to Weird Deck Techs. And today we're going to be talking about an archetype that's notorious for how mediocre it is. And that is going to be Gimmick Puppets. Gimmick Puppets are a Zexal-era archetype that aesthetically look like what would happen if you took the Shadows and dragged them through Silent Hill. While all the Gimmick Puppets are machine types, they mimic zombie-type monsters in the way that they bury themselves into the graveyard. One of the things that the Gimmick Puppets are most well known for is their win condition, which is bad. It's simply just bad. It all requires on keeping itself out for a duration of 3 turns, and even then, if you can get that to happen, maybe even getting the effect to work might not happen. So let's go ahead, take a look at the deck, and see what the deal is with Gimmick Puppets. Alright, so here we have the Gimmick Puppet deck, so let's go ahead and take a look at it real quick here. This deck was fairly easy to build. There are quite a few Gimmick Puppet cards that were easy to leave out, but let's take a look at what we have here. So starting off, we have 3 copies of Gimmick Puppet Nightmare. You can special summon this card from your hand by tributing 1 face-up Xyz monster you control. You can only special summon Gimmick Puppet Nightmare once per turn this way. When you do, you can special summon 1 Gimmick Puppet Nightmare from your hand or graveyard. If this card is special summoned, you cannot special summon any monster for the rest of the turn except Gimmick Puppet monsters. Now, our Xyz monsters are all, I believe they're all rank 8, so they all require level 8 monsters. We'll check that when we get to the extra deck part. But I tried to make this deck as much as I could. I tried to make this deck so that you could easily bring out your Xyz monsters. So hopefully that reflects. Moving on, we've got 3 copies of Gimmick Puppet Bisque Doll. You can special summon this card from your hand by discarding 1 Gimmick Puppet monster. You can banish this card from your graveyard, and your opponent cannot target Gimmick Puppet monsters you control with card effects for this turn. Quick and easy shutdown for any card effect targeting. Next up, we've got 1 copy of Gimmick Puppet Magnet Doll. If your opponent controls a monster and all monsters you control are face-up Gimmick Puppet monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand. Figured putting this at 1 would make it, it's an easy card to get out with all of the pure Gimmick Puppets, but there are also just other better cards to get out. But maybe I would be more entitled to give this card more than 1 copy, because it's not a hard once per turn, it's not even a soft once per turn, and you could go ahead and just special summon as many of these as you want. But the problem with that is that it relies on your opponent controlling a monster, and so if your opponent knows your strategy with this deck, they're just gonna run away from that. But that's not something that you can predict. Next up, we've got 2 copies of Gimmick Puppet Shadow Feeler. Cannot be destroyed by battle. When you take battle damage from an opponent's direct attack while this card is in your graveyard, you can special summon this card from your graveyard in face-up attack position, and if you do, take 1000 damage. You can only use this effect of Gimmick Puppet Shadow Feeler once per turn. If this card is an Xyz material and would be sent to the graveyard, banish it instead. Next up, we've got 1 copy of Gimmick Puppet Twilight Joker. When a Gimmick Puppet monster you control is destroyed by battle and sent to your graveyard, you can banish that monster, special summon this card from your hand. You can only use the effect of Gimmick Puppet Twilight Joker once per turn. Next up, we've got 3 copies of Gimmick Puppet Dreary Doll. If this card is in your graveyard, you can banish 1 other Gimmick Puppet monster from your graveyard, special summon this card. You can only use this effect of Gimmick Puppet Dreary Doll once per turn. Cannot be used as material for an Xyz summon except for the Xyz summon of a Gimmick Puppet monster. Next, we have 3 copies of Gimmick Puppet Egghead. You can only use the effect of Gimmick Puppet Egghead once per turn. You can discard 1 Gimmick Puppet monster, then activate 1 of these effects. Either you inflict 800 damage to your opponent, or this card's level becomes 8 until the end phase. A little more ramp to get out our Xyz monsters, hopefully a little bit faster with this card. We have 2 copies of Gimmick Puppet Destroy. Once while face up on the field, you can target 1 Gimmick Puppet monster on the field and destroy it. When this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 or 2 Gimmick Puppet monsters from your hand. I figured the special summoning from the hand would be good if you can get 2 Gimmick Puppet monsters out, but I figure that's kind of situational, so we're going to keep this at 2. We have 3 copies of Gimmick Puppet Scissor Arms. When this card is normal summoned, you can send 1 Gimmick Puppet monster from your deck to the graveyard. It's interesting that we get a free residential Foolish Burial for the deck. We have 3 copies of Gimmick Puppet Terror Baby. When this card is normal summoned, you can target 1 Gimmick Puppet monster in your graveyard, except Gimmick Puppet Terror Baby, special summon it in defense mode. You can banish this card from your graveyard. Your opponent cannot activate cards or effects in response to the activation of your Gimmick Puppet monster effects this turn. It's a free spell speed 4 for all of our Gimmick Puppets. We have 3 copies of Gimmick Puppet Humpty Dumpty. When this card is normal or special summoned, you can special summon 1 Gimmick Puppet monster from your hand. You can only use this effect of Gimmick Puppet Humpty Dumpty once per turn. We have 3 copies of Gimmick Puppet Gear Changer. Cannot be special summoned from the deck. Once per turn, you can target 1 Gimmick Puppet monster you control, except this card. This card's level becomes the level of that monster. Moving on to our spells for the deck, we have 3 copies of Perform Puppet. It is a continuous spell. You can banish 1 Gimmick Puppet monster from your graveyard. All monsters you currently control become that banished monster's level until the end of this turn, even if this card leaves the field. If a face-up Gimmick Puppet monster you control is destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect and sent to the graveyard, you can target 1 of your banished Gimmick Puppet monsters and special summon it. You can only use each effect of Perform Puppet once per turn. Next, we have 3 copies of Condolence Puppet. Send Gimmick Puppet monsters with different names from your deck to the graveyard up to the number of monsters your opponent controls that were special summoned from the extra deck plus 1. You can banish this card from your graveyard, then target 1 Machine XC's monster you control. It cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects while face up on the field. You can only use each effect of Condolence Puppet once per turn. We have 3 copies of Junk Puppet. Target 1 Gimmick Puppet monster in your graveyard, special summon it. You can only activate 1 Junk Puppet per turn. And finally, for the main deck, we have 1 copy of Puppet Ritual. If your opponent's life points are at least 2,000 higher than yours, you can target 2 level 8 Gimmick Puppet monsters in your graveyard. Special summon those targets. You can only activate 1 Puppet Ritual per turn. You cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this card. So that's it for the main deck. Moving on to the extra deck, we're starting off with 1 copy of number 88, Gimmick Puppet of Leo. It requires 3 level 8 monsters to summon. Once per turn, if you have no cards in your spell and trap zone, you can detach 1 Xyz material from this card, and if you do, place 1 destiny counter on this card. You cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this effect. When 3 destiny counters are on this card, you win the duel. It's a win condition that's not very good. Notoriously not very good. So I figure if we have 1 of these, we might be able to pull it off, but we most likely aren't, so we aren't going to flood the extra deck with this card. Next, we have 2 copies of number 40, Gimmick Puppet of Strings. It requires 2 level 8 monsters to summon. Once per turn, you can detach 1 material from this card, place 1 string counter on each face-up monster on the field, except this card. Once per turn during the next end phase of the opponent of the player who placed a string counter by this effect, that's confusing wording, destroy the monsters with string counters, and if you do, inflict 500 damage to your opponent for each monster destroyed. So I don't know why this card, during its second effect, has that long drawn-out explanation for itself. It would be better if it just said, during the next end phase of your opponent. You know, shorten it just by a little bit, but that's still all the difference. But I feel like this could be a decent card, not great. Again, a lot of these Gimmick Puppet cards seem like they'd be kind of hard to get out, but that's mainly just because of the way that Gimmick Puppet works. Like I said earlier, having that card that special summons itself when you have other Gimmick Puppets out would probably do great for this deck, but it does rely on your opponent having a monster. Moving on, we have 3 copies of number 15, Gimmick Puppet Giant Grinder. It requires 2 level 8 monsters to be summoned. Up to twice per turn during your main phase 1, you can detach 1 Xyz material from this card, then target 1 special summon monster your opponent controls, destroy it. Then, if it was an Xyz monster, inflict damage to your opponent equal to its original attack. Now, I treat this monster as the boss monster of the deck, even though it's a targeting removal spell. I feel like if you can get around any negates or any cards that, don't target, if you can add cards into the deck that can get you to do that, this card could be fine. It's not going to be the best card in the world, but it could be decent. And I feel like that's why this could be considered a boss monster of the deck. Nearing the end of the extra deck, we have 3 copies of Gimmick Puppet Gigantus Doll. It requires 2 level 4 Gimmick Puppet monsters. You can detach 2 materials from this card, then target up to 2 monsters your opponent controls, gain control of them until the end phase. Also, for the rest of this turn, you cannot special summon monsters except Gimmick Puppet monsters, nor declare an attack except with Xyz monsters. That's a mouthful, but you get the point. You contribute this card, all monsters you currently control become level 8 until the end of this turn. You can only use each effect of Gimmick Puppet Gigantus Doll once per turn. I like the mind control aspect of the card, but that's probably not going to go through as well as the second effect, which is the helping of getting out other Xyz monsters from this deck. We're ending the deck off now with the final card of the extra deck. The reason I'm on this page is because Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro Deck is acting weird, but ending the deck off in its entirety, we have 3 copies of Gimmick Puppet Chimera Doll. It requires 2 machine monsters to be summoned, and during your main phase, if you control this link summoned card, you can activate this effect. You also cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck for the rest of this turn, except machine Xyz monsters. Also, take 1 Gimmick Puppet monster from your deck and either add it to your hand or send it to the graveyard. Then, if all monsters you control are Gimmick Puppet monsters, you can special summon 1 Gimmick Puppet monster from your hand. You can only use this effect of Gimmick Puppet Chimera Doll once per turn. A long drawn out way to either give us a tutor or give us a foolish burial. So now that we are done, how do we feel about this deck and how would I play it? Well, looking at the deck as a whole, I can definitely see where a lot of the problems with the deck come in. It's overly reliant on getting out its Xyz monsters. It's overly reliant in dumping things into the graveyard, but it doesn't really seem to have a specific goal in mind. You know, it's constantly dumping stuff in the graveyard. Its goal is seemingly to bring out your Leo and win the duel ultimately, but that requires a lot of controlling your opponent that this deck purely doesn't hold, and I don't think there's a lot that you can add to this deck to really hold it up to its own standard. As for how I would play this deck, I'm not really sure. This deck kind of locks itself into a problem where it worries only about Gimmick Puppets, and I know that that's a lot of archetypes nowadays, that they worry only about themselves. However, if we added just a little bit more generic text here, we could probably make this deck work kind of okay-ish with Skull Servants or Vampires or a deck like that. The problem here is that the Gimmick Puppets, instead of being zombies, are all machines. So we could add a bunch of machine type, generic support in here, limiter removal, some of the cards that you would put in a Viacroid deck, stuff like that. Ideally, you could also put Foolish Burial in here. This deck also does have a lot of C numbers, a lot of cards that rely on rank up Magic Force, and you can tell that I didn't put any of them in here because I was trying to run this deck as pure as possible, and if the deck could be run without Magic Force, which it can kind of, then I wanted to build it that way. The problem with the rank up magic is that there are plenty of rank up magics to choose from, and even then, with having the C numbers in the deck doesn't really hold on its own. I personally don't really know how I would play this deck. It's definitely a weird type of deck that I probably wouldn't play if given the opportunity. But that's just my thoughts on the deck. I don't really have a strong opinion on Gimmick Puppets. I think aesthetically speaking, in their art, they're pretty neat to look at, but other than that, in gameplay wise, I wouldn't run this deck. So those are my feelings on the deck, and let's go back to me. And there you have it, all of our machine menaces in one table. As you can tell during the deck building part, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do with this deck. Like, even trying to build this deck on my own, I wouldn't really know how to build it. But that's just me. How would you feel about this deck? How do you feel about it now that you've seen how I've built it in its pure form? Do you think that you could make Gimmick Puppets work even just a little bit? Do you think that they will be bad until they completely get a rehaul? Let me know down below. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, drink your water.